Okay. Okay, great. It's not a problem. Thank you very much. So the reason I wanted to get you guys on the phone was because we wanted to go a little bit further in depth with the stuff that Deepa had sent. Um, so basically, what we're trying to do is develop this piece for our Inspire blog, and I'm thinking that what I'll do is take lots of notes and then think through what we find, and then I can either send that back to you, Sandro, to have you develop something, or we can develop it on our end and you can review it, whichever you think is easiest from your side. I mean,
Okay. It might be easiest if you develop at your end, Joe, just because I'm conscious where how busy things are in Australia, and particularly now that we're looking down the barrel of a potential third wave, or whatever it will be of COVID. I think we could be very busy in the first couple of weeks of next year. So I think that might be best for us. And then it'd be important Mark has a look over it as well, because it's really his work that is building the fundamentals of it.
okay, great. That's perfect. That's fine. Okay, so without further ado, the first thing that I wanted to get into was sort of the nuts and bolts of your process. We noticed that it's you do a lot of research, but I'm wondering if you could start from the very beginning and talk to me a bit about the process you follow when you're going to try to apply this framing approach.
Sure, maybe I'll start, Mark, and then you can talk about the actual methodology. So we know that framing and the way that we communicate and the values that we use when we communicate or speak to when we communicate, whether it's to policymakers, the public, or other healthcare or public health professionals, is fundamental. It can completely change the way the message is received and the reaction that it elicits. And so I think particularly in some areas of public health, over the last decade we've seen the values that they elicit or that they speak to, but also the purposeful framing of those become quite problematic. Whether we think about climate change or obesity, they've both been heavily politicised by one perspective of the issue, really at the cost of progress and at the cost of meaningful discussion and engagement, and quite purposefully done. And there's good evidence that shows that whether it's the beverage industry, the sugary beverage industry, or whether it's the oil industry, these kind of framings and different ways of speaking about the issue and the evidence that they speak to when they are speaking about the issue, none of this has happened by accident. This is all a very purposeful exercise to try and derail public discourse and to take attention away from policy leaders in particular that are effective for these public health challenges. And by politicising the policy issues or the policy responses, and actually more than that, by politicising the issues themselves, not even the policy responses, because they are political, but actually by politicising the very issues themselves, whether it's obesity or climate change as two examples, you do end up with a very toxic at times conversation. It makes it much harder to engage and let alone to get policy action. So I think Mark's work really predates me coming to Big Health, but it is an incredibly insightful and important piece of the public health puzzle, because what it allows us to do is to start to rebalance, the way that we communicate and speak to populations, colleagues, policymakers, but particularly the public, in a way that starts to engender support, not necessarily just through persuasion, but actually through really speaking to the deep core values that we all share, and probably allowing us to manoeuvre around the politicisation of some of these public health challenges. We found it highly effective. We found that the public, that the colleagues and the public health sector have found it very helpful. And sadly, I think we were a long way behind, and I'd love for Mark to comment as well. But I mean, I think industry have been using these sorts of insights and approaches. So it's really largely a process of rebalancing the playing field, and then speaking in a way to the public that allows the public to understand and work to support the public to understand and engage in these public health challenges in a meaningful way that resonates and that allows them to see through the kind of noise to where progress can be made.
Mark, could you expound a bit on that? I mean, where does it, how does it work?
Yeah, so I might just start by sharing my screen. Can you see that image, that slide there, Joe?
Yeah.
So I'll give you a few really quick slides just to give you a bit of background, a very short background on the approach and the assumptions, and therefore how we actually get started with any sort of research project. And this is a visual illusion. I often start presentations by showing people this to sort of illustrate one of these core concepts, and it's biconceptualism. So the ability of people to perceive the same information from different perspectives. And it's really important because our brains, and I should actually check, you can see the rabbit and the duck, or the bird and the rabbit.
Right.
What's happening in your brain is automatically, without you having to tell it to, making different meanings out of what it's seeing here. So you didn't have to go, well, what is this? Let me try and figure it out in a step-by-step rational way. This is what our brains do. They're always trying to make meaning out of the world, but it can actually make very different meanings out of the exact same situations or issues or even the exact same sets of facts. So understanding this is really important because we split all audiences on any issue into three different groups. Based on sort of our understanding of their biconceptualism. So on the one hand, on any issue, you're going to have supporters. And these are people who see the issue from your perspective. They very much understand the problem the same way you do. They understand the solutions the same way you do. In other words, they support them wholeheartedly. But they're actually quite inflexible in their thinking. And I can't help but think of US politics when I'm presenting this, so you might resonate with you. And they're quite inflexible in the thinking. So let's say, for argument's sake, the supporters only see the rabbit, and you try as hard as you can to explain to them that the actual rabbit's ears are actually the sort of the beak of the duck, but they still can't see it because they're so entrenched in their rabbit way of seeing the world. Now, on the other side, you've got our opposition. So these are people who don't agree with the problem. They do not agree with our solutions. And they are also very inflexible in their thinking, and they only see the duck. And you try to explain to them that there's a rabbit there, and they just fail to see it. But in the middle, there are persuadable people, and these are the vast majority of people on any issue. And they can toggle quite easily between seeing the duck and seeing the rabbit. All you have to do is lead them there very gently, point out that the rabbit is looking to the right and the duck's sort of looking a little bit upwards to the left. And then they can see it. And these people, they're typically 50 to 70% of the population on any issue. And it's both because they're a little bit less bought into the issue, they've thought about it less, so they've formed their opinions less strongly. But it's not just that they have weak opinions. Sometimes they can very strongly agree when we talk about it from a supporter perspective. They can go, yes, hell yeah, you're totally right about that. But frustratingly, when the opposition presents a compelling frame to them, they then turn around and say, yes, you're totally right about that too. And sometimes they can be quite contradictory. So we tend to think about people, there's a saying in communications that you've got to meet people where they're at. And there's a lot of truth to knowing people, and helps you then tap into their lived experience in the way that you talk to them. That's all fine and well. But it's very misleading to assume that people are in a fixed location. People very much can toggle between very different ways of thinking about issues. And depending on which way or which perspective or which frame they're thinking about the issue from, they'll actually arrive at different conclusions as to what's right and wrong. And they might support you if they're thinking about it this way, but be against you if they're thinking about it from a different way. So our research very much starts from the perspective of saying, well, look, there is a dominant frame for this issue. There's a way that we're all talking about it, but is it helpful to us? And a lot of the times it's not. Otherwise, people don't recruit me and say, Mark, help us talk about this, because they've already got everything they want, because everyone sees it from the right perspective, or the helpful perspective. So our job really is to look outside of that dominant frame and say, what are the different ways that people think and talk about this issue, knowing that some of these are going to be useful to us and some of them not. And our entire research process is about answering the question, firstly, what other ways are there of thinking about this issue? And then sort of really conceptually different ways of thinking about the issue. And then the second question becomes, okay, which of these is useful to us and which of these is actually harmful to us, because it prevents people from seeing it from our perspective. And as Sandra already spoke about, one of the key things behind our framework is very much values, and I won't go into that in any depth because we do sort of full-day workshops on values and how they work. But we know a lot about when different types of motivations are driving people, they tend to think and act either more pro-socially and environmentally responsibly, or less pro-social or sort of anti-socially and sort of environmentally destructively. So one thing that we do in evaluating what frames might be useful to us and which ones might not be is look at the values at play and sort of just know from 3 decades now of value science which might be useful and which might be not. And then, of course, what our dial tests do is then validating those assumptions. So in terms of the very, very first step, I'll stop sharing my screen. The very, very first step for our process is to figure out how do our supporters or key advocates for this issue, how do they think about it? What are the metaphors they use? What sort of values do they sort of use when they're thinking about the issue? And so we'll do what we call elicitation interviews, where we interview at least 15 people who we ask, whatever partner we're working with, for example, Big Health, they might send us a list of 15 people sort of working in different areas on that issue and the only criteria that we really have is that these people are deeply passionate about it, that they see the issue very much from Vic Health's perspective. They agree with, or they all agree about the problem. They're all in agreement about the solutions required. Let me talk to them and understand the patterns in how they're thinking about the issue. And so we ask really fundamental questions. So if it's, let's say it's about alcohol, or alcohol regulation is the topic area, the very first question I would probably ask that group of people is, what is alcohol? And then, why do people use alcohol? And sort of really basic questions that they don't tend to get asked on a day-to-day basis. So I don't want to hear their key messages. I want to hear how they really think about it. And from that gives us an understanding of, okay, so this is the perspective that someone who is seeing the issue from the most useful perspective possible, this is the way they think about it. And then what we do is we do the public discourse analysis to look at how people are talking about it in the public. That gives us a sense of the different frames that are out there. And which ones might be useful is based on a gap analysis between the way advocates think about it and the way the public is thinking about it, and which frames bring us closest to seeing the issue from an advocate perspective. And that's sort of, is that a good enough answer for sort of how do we get started?
Yeah, that's great. So there's you're doing a lot of analysis of language, basically, right? I mean, you're looking at the way people are thinking about this issue. You're identifying the sort of main way they look at it, and then you look for these other ways that might be helpful for you to promote it. Is it mainly then about developing sort of advocacy communication? Am I thinking about it right? I mean, in the idea that what you're going to try to do is get people to be more supportive, or what is the word, to advocate for a certain position in policy discussions?
It depends. So it depends on what the brief is. So, with alcohol policy, for example, we knew, so in talking to advocates, I was both trying to understand how do they think about it, how do they conceptually think about it, the issue, and some of the key things that you're looking at is what actors are in the frame. When advocates talk about the problem, what actors do they focus on? And interestingly enough, in the interviews, for example, for that project, the key actors that advocates are talking about is industry. It's all about the industry and all the horrible things that they do and the mischievous things that they do to manipulate people and the way they don't care about people. So it also gives me a sense of the values at play here too. But when they're talking about the issue publicly, all they talk about is the drinkers. So they're actually focused on different actors when they're framing the issue publicly to how they think about it themselves. So one of the key shifts that we recommended there was, well, actually, we need to bring the industry into the frame, make sure they're always front and centre when we're talking about this issue, because that is the perspective that gets someone to get angry and say, we need to regulate this industry. Whereas when we're focused on drinkers, all that's doing is activating a defensive perspective in, the majority of people who do drink alcohol.
Right.
So that's sort of what's going on there.
Okay. So when we, I'm just thinking about, so you get an idea of the way people are thinking about and understanding these issues. Do you know if you've used it to actually change people's behaviors? Let's say when you talk about alcohol, is part of the aim there, or has been part of the aim, to actually change people's drinking behaviors? And what have you measured that? Has there been an outcome on that level?
So we haven't focused on, in our work with Big Health, and actually in our work with others, we haven't focused on behaviour change specifically. We've had an eye to it, knowing that we don't want to increase, for example, we don't want to increase support for policy at the same time as somehow negatively influencing behaviour. So we in our DAL testing, or in our online survey, which is where we're sort of validating our assumptions that we generate through the discourse analysis, we will always have a view to that. But all we can measure in a survey, of course, is behavioural intention. We don't know what happens to behaviour, and it's entirely possible to do research around that, but that's not what we focus on. We're looking mostly at motivation, because in behaviour change, it's not just about motivation. There's also, do people have the skills? Do they have, is the external environment or the context facilitating the behaviours we want? And you would look at all of that. You don't just look at people's motivation. But with our work, sort of the work that we do at Common Cause, and Vic Health obviously does things much broader than just motivation and messaging, but in our messaging framing work, it is about that motivation, that one element of the behaviour change question. How do we amp up the level of motivation as high as we possibly can through messaging? And that is part of the equation. It's never the full story with behaviour change.
Okay, but do you think...
So we use it, Joe, really with around policy advocacy. That's the focus for us. So it's around whether we're speaking to the public or whether we're speaking to policymakers, and particularly making sure that there's alignment across the public health sector, that we use it as a kind of common set of framing messages. So, Mark has done work for us on a range of different issues, including now child obesity, and it clearly shows, it's changed the way that we work, it's changed the way that we communicate, and even the way that we actually frame our public health interventions and approaches, because at the end of the day, we need to, a lot of the, as you know, a lot of the major solutions, a lot of the very meaningful solutions in the public health space are born and solved in policy, but trying to get policymakers to act and trying to get public support for policies is not always easy, again, in the context of the politicisation of some of these issues like obesity. So if you can use certain framings that are, much more effective and that really galvanise that 70% of the middle ground that Mark talked about, for us as a public health agency that require getting either the support of government or the support of the public to support government, it's a highly effective part of the puzzle. We then develop behaviour change campaigns and messages that sit separate to Mark's work and to the work we do around values-based messaging. So our focus so far has really been, the only exceptions, Mark, might be in alcohol, for example, where we looked at the language used by industry around the behaviour, the so-called relationship with alcohol. And again, this is language used by the public health community, but actually what it does is that it it promotes this idea that we have this very intimate relationship. It's very personal. It's very meaningful. It's bilateral, and that it's different from person to person. You know, like a human relationship. But of course, we know that's not the case. And if you talk about alcohol products, and you talk about alcohol harm, and you talk about environments free from certain alcohol harms, then people are very, very supportive. Whereas if you talk about the relationship that you each have with alcohol, which is what industry uses, the framing industry uses, and governments getting involved in that relationship and bringing about policies that disrupt the relationship that you have, you can understand that would elicit a very different response from the public, and may actually also elicit a response that relates to their behaviours. But that's not the main aim for us.
Okay, that's clear. I'm wondering if when I saw this, I thought I saw the persuadable messaging thing, the document, very nicely done and very interesting. I'm wondering, one of the things we try to do with this blog series is we try to bring out the sort of the innovation or something novel about the approach you're using. So I know that can be a bit difficult because obviously you didn't just come up with this overnight. It's something obviously very thoughtful and based on a lot of research and understanding. But what can you tell me about the novelty of what you're doing now compared to like what people might have done 10 years ago in this space? What's different? I know.
Well, I think from a I'm going to have to go in a second, but I think from a public health agency perspective, I mean, the work that Mark's done has really changed the way we frame and talk about the public health challenges that we're wanting to address, and I think they've been far more effective in communicating and advocating for some of those changes with the public and also with policymakers. And I think it is in the context, as I said, I keep coming back to this concept of the politicization of public health issues, but we can't get away from that. I mean, fundamentally, climate change has become a political issue, not the responses, but the issue, but climate change itself, and that is a purposeful approach by industry to delay or defer action. And by creating clear, widely resonating messages that actually speak to the core issues in a way that we're not using jargon, we're not playing into the hands of the wrong types of framing. It has allowed, I think it does allow public health to start to, or the public policy and public health communities to start to move these issues, these critical and urgent public health issues forward. And I think there are also messages that relate to COVID and maybe Mark, I don't think we've done specific research. He's done specific research in that space, but even the way we talk about sort of advertising and food labeling or taxation and fiscal policy measures, the way that Mark's research has informed has completely changed the way that we frame, across the board, most of the public health issues that we are advocating for. And ironically, for many years, we were communicating them in a really counter-productive way, which is kind of frightening because I spent years, Joe, talking about the myths of NCDs. Well, it turns out that if you talk about myths, it just reinforces the myth and people walk away remembering the myth and not the truth. So it's better just to talk about the facts. There are some things that you can understand, like speaking to the benefits for younger people or speaking to very clear disease outcomes rather than sort of broad, generic outcomes. There are some, for us, the innovation has been really understanding how we, in a world of misinformation and a very noisy information landscape, how do we really try and get cut through that speaks to and communicates what are fundamentally beneficial opportunities, policy opportunities that will benefit the vast majority of the public, how do we communicate it in a way that it does actually cut through sufficiently that we can have a meaningful conversation with the public and with policymakers, and hopefully then engender where democracies sit the important policy processes of the public then supporting that change. I think this has been a really important step forward for us as a health agency, and when we speak to others around the world, it's similarly been quite kind of transformational for them as well.
So it's the realization that there's a better way to communicate. There's a better way to connect with people that's going to be more influential, that's going to have more weight. It's going to fit in. It's going to reach them, right? Because it's not going to trigger maybe a different story or a different idea or an oppositional idea. It's going to actually integrate with with maybe how they're willing to see the world, or maybe they already see the world. Is that right, or is that on the right level?
Yeah, that's how we see it, and it's one piece of a bigger puzzle for us. It's not the only piece, but it's a very important one, and for relatively, it presents a very high return on investment for us, because we could spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars on public messaging campaigns to try and support certain policy outcomes, or partners could, or you might be asking the public to do something, or you might be calling out industry behaviours. But if you're framing it in a way that is not going to resonate, that actually could do more damage than bring benefit, or that may, as we saw, I think over the last 10 years in the NCD space, a lot of the time when we talked, it actually just engendered stigma and shame. We've tried to talk about social determinants, but I think we've talked about them at times in a way that becomes very esoteric and difficult to understand, and so the public disconnect because they see it as sort of something that's not tangible. We've talked about, as I said, myths. We've talked about, we've used language that the industry actually created. So we've made all of these mistakes over the last 10 years. And I think Mark's work's really brought to the fore in a very clear, evidence-based way, all of the pitfalls that I certainly at times have fallen into, that do impact then the way the message is received, the response that it gets, and the support that it engenders. And so by using the right messaging and approach, you can flip that. You can end up with a far more, you end up with a response. You end up with an emotional, but also a physical response and an intellectual response from the audience that you're trying to reach, that is more aligned with their values, and also the public health outcomes that we're really trying to push for. I'm going to have to run, Joe. I'm running quite late, and I'm also conscious that Mark is really the guru, and I'm speaking way too much. So I'm going to duck out. I will send you the recording of this, and you should be able to still continue the call without me. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, awesome.
If we
you're recording it at home too.
Yeah, I am. Thank you so much, Sandro. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate your time.
No, you're so welcome. I'm so sorry, Joe. It's just the last week before Christmas.
No, please don't be sorry. We're very grateful for your time, Sandro, and I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Have a great holiday.
See you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, so I have so basically, I'm still trying to come up with a sense of what might be different, what might be new. Can you address? Yeah.
Yeah, and just to check, are you recording this still yourself? Because
well, I've got it on my phone, but that'll work. That'll work. I mean, it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I mean there is so much that is novel about this, and I know that for sure because we do a lot of training work with people and sort of and mentoring work, and the thing that I find most enjoyable about presenting this stuff is the way in which it totally transforms how people think about communications. So if I think about what are the things that people find most challenging, or sort of what are the assumptions that we turn on people's heads when they're introduced to this approach. One of them is just that concept that I talked about initially about meeting people where they're at, which is a common sense thing that we do in communications, but actually often leads to really poor outcomes. So that's an assumption that in order to engage with people, we need to understand what is their dominant way of thinking about this, and let's tap into that and then, quote unquote, take them on a journey. But what you're doing there is you're engaging the frames that then trap people there, and they can't think outside of those frames. Because frames, picture frames and cognitive frames are similar in that they determine what is in the story and what's not in the story. So if we activate an unhelpful frame, that is where people get stuck and it's not helpful. So what people often do in communication research or message research is they'll do focus groups. They'll just do interviews with the general public and say, how do you think about this issue? Let's seek to understand how you think about this issue. Then we can talk to you about it in the way that you understand. But once you realise that people have different ways that they can think about issues, you realise that that's completely ridiculous approach to messaging, because then all you are doing is reinforcing the existing thinking. And if it's the thinking that got us to where we are now and you want that to change, then, that's obviously not the path forward. So our approach is very much about taking people to where they're capable of going, knowing where else they can go, and not seeking to take them on a journey, but actually toggling them there from the very first moment we open our mouths. So making sure that we are speaking from the new frame at all times. And the key thing that is different here is my sort of key advice is never talk about the issue from your opposition's perspective or from unhelpful perspectives. So never pander to it. And so Sandra mentioned myth busting. That is one of the most common examples of people pandering to the opposition frame. So they'll proactively remind people of the very myths they want them to forget. And what is happening inside people's brains is that when you repeat the myth, it activates the same neurons as if they're telling the myth themselves. And every time that neurons fire, they strengthen those connections between each other. And so you're literally strengthening the network in people's brains that is dedicated to that myth, making that myth easier to activate in the future, and more believable as well, because the more that something is a strong idea in our heads, the more we believe it to be true, which is one of our sort of silly cognitive biases that probably makes sense most of the time, but is easily manipulated. So sort of starting from where people are at, or seeking to understand where are you now, is not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is, where are the different places where you could be? It's not about creating a new frame. It's not about creating brand new networks of neurons in people's heads. That is a task beyond most of us. We don't have the advertising budget to do that. It's about understanding what are helpful ideas that we can connect to our issue, or get people to see our issue through that lens. So I think that's one of the big things, is not meeting people where they're at, but actually thinking about where else can they go.
Okay.
What other ways are there of thinking about this issue, and avoiding like all hell activating those dominant frames. Because like Sandra said, the reason why people in this space, and people on many progressive issues that we work on, the reason why they are not succeeding isn't just because they haven't created a great message. It's because sometimes their messaging is actually doing more harm than good, because they're activating unhelpful ideas without realizing it, because they're swimming in a sea of unhelpful ideas, and every time that they just, without thinking, repeat those ideas, they're strengthening those unhelpful frames. So that's a key thing, is to understand both what is useful but also what is not useful, because once we realize what is not useful and we keep that in mind, we can avoid it. Because otherwise we say the words that we've heard before because they're sort of easy and we know they're good tropes to roll out, but maybe they're not helpful. So that's it. So understanding both what's useful and what's not useful, and then only engaging useful stuff. The other thing that is...
sorry, Mark, but when you go about trying to determine that, you do that through, like you said, you talk to people and you listen and you review. If I looked at that document correctly, it looks like there's a lot of data that you look at to try to figure out how the stories are being constructed. Can you unpack that a bit for me? What's happening there?
Yep. So what we're looking at there is, so first we understand what is the advocate story, what is a supporter perspective. Once we know that, then we can look at the public discourse and say, okay, so what ways of talking about this publicly are activating that perspective, and which ones are activating different logic or whatever. And so we will literally grab text. So we'll look at how is the media talking about this issue, how are politicians, how are advocates talking about it publicly, how are supporters, how's the public talking about it in social media or on comments on news articles about the topic. And then we will take those pieces of discourse and we will code them. What characters are they focused on? And are they different to the characters that advocates focus on when they're thinking about the issue at that basic building blocks level? What values are being applied to the issue here? Is that different to what advocates use when they're sort of thinking about it in a raw format? So characters, values, story logic, like what is the causation of the problem? If that's the problem, how are different people explaining why that problem exists? So a recent piece of work we did was on gender equality. And one thing that we found is that in the public domain, when advocates talk about gender inequality, what they do is they simply say, research shows that men and women have different outcomes, whether it's in relation to power, money, or anything else, amount of housework they do. But the problem is they rarely explain why there are differences between men and women. And the issue with that is there is an opposition narrative, and that is that men and women are just fundamentally, biologically different. And therefore, if men and women are different, it is no great surprise that they have different outcomes. Maybe men are just simply better at business. Maybe politics is more suited to men, right? So simply pointing out the problem without explaining the cause. So if that cause part of the story is missing, that can be an issue. So when we then tested messaging, which focused on the cause. So one of the causes, obviously, is that men and women are treated differently because of their gender. That leads to unequal outcomes. So if we put that into the story, all of a sudden what we noticed when we did the testing is persuadables were on our side. So we were losing when we simply focused on outcomes. But as soon as we inserted a bit of causal logic into the story, we had people on our side. So we also look at story logic, like are all parts of the story being told here, or we only focus on one without explaining why that might exist. So that's what we're doing. So we're just looking for obvious, and to be honest, there's some really common problems that people make. The myth-busting thing, I will find it in every single research project. People are doing that. And they're sort of, there's the myth-busting, there's the failure to tell the causation story, just, hey, this problem exists, therefore we've got to fix it. Whereas if you don't explain why that problem goes against the very values of your community, then, yeah. So there's all sorts of different things that we're looking for there. And to be honest, you know, you're looking at this for an article so that people can sort of think, can I use this in my own work? In many ways, the process that we go through is a very expert process, right? Because it's a sort of people who understand cognitive linguistics and how to metaphor work, and it's hard to actually figure out what metaphor is this actually here, sort of, because you've got to understand a little bit about how metaphor work to do that, because it's not the flowery metaphors we're looking for. And in fact, I just use the word flowery, which is a metaphor that people use, and I know you understand because it has. So our language is just littered with all sorts of different things that if you're not an expert, it's hard to pick up on it because it goes straight through you. You don't realise that it's significant. So that's is that answering your question?
Yeah. It gets very complicated, doesn't it? I'm curious about the process you described pretty well. I think it sounds. The aspect about the expert, though, you're right that we want to write something that I should tell you a bit more context here. We want to write something that nutrition practitioners around the world can read and sort of then not necessarily apply in their own work, but at least appreciate the perspective when they go to do their work. So it would be great if they sort of appreciated that, there's this thing called framing, and it's going on when you're communicating about whatever problem you're communicating about. Now, that said, a lot of our work, or a lot of our offices work on advocacy issues, and this would fit in well. on an advocacy campaign. Obviously, there's direct relevance there. But our actual blog series currently is focusing on a specific set of behaviors that are sort of summed up under the umbrella term of complementary feeding. And complementary feeding refers to the period of 6 months to about 24 months in a child's life when they still should be getting breast milk, but they need to get other foods as they transition to a more mature body. And so what we're trying to do there is we're talking about complementary feeding and SBC approaches, or social behavior change approaches, to address complementary feeding behaviors. But one of the things that we've found, or that's sort of inherent to complementary feeding, is it's very complex because it's not a single behavior. It goes over a period of time that's pretty vast. There's a lot of changes going on for a child, for his family or her family. So there's a lot going on. And I'm wondering, in this situation, if we're talking about trying to change behaviors, change behaviors generally, but in complementary feeding specifically, we ourselves are trying to figure out, how does this fit in? What would we tell practitioners about using framing or using these ideas in their work to improve complementary feeding behavior change? So I'm not sure if that's enough. What would you say about that?
That's great. So, and practical example means that we can get real sort of tangible here. Well, the first thing to do is to understand what is the behavior you're trying to create, right? So can you just tell me very quickly, I know it's complicated, but tell me some key sort of, what is are you trying to get people to continue breastfeeding, or is it more about introducing new foods and variety?
Let's just say, well, obviously it would. This is sort of the problem. It would be some of both of that. But let's say it was just like you're just trying to introduce a new ingredient in the cooking of the family home. For example, iron-rich foods like dark green vegetables, into the diet. Let's say it was that.
So, and here's where I do think that you would not have a single approach across the board, right? If some of it is about introducing specific foods, at other times it's about introducing foods altogether, at other times it's about continuing with breastfeeding while introducing those foods. Like, each of those may require different messaging, because what you're doing is, and here's the other thing that is different about this, it is potentially novel, and it's not novel in the commercial marketing world, but it surprises me how novel it is to a lot of practitioners in health promotion, is that facts don't convince people, stories do. And so the approach that people often take is, well, let's give people the facts. Leafy greens provide these things, your body needs those things, therefore, ipso facto, you should be doing this. Whereas what drives human behavior more than anything else is emotions, and we respond emotionally to stories. And if facts contradict how we feel about an issue or the story we have for that issue already, then the facts bounce off. We ignore the facts, we go and we find our own facts that back up how we already felt, sort of, oh, well, my mother did this, therefore that's what I should do. Like, I turned out all right. So fact-based communication doesn't persuade people, because if they're already persuaded, they're already on board, and the facts they'll accept. So what I'd be looking for in that particular example would be, okay, so if we want to introduce leafy green vegetables into the diet, people who already do that, how do they think about it? Why do they do that? What are leafy green vegetables? What do babies need? Why do people feed babies food? Like, understanding at the very basic sort of logic of how they think about that, and then looking for how other people talk about it. People who don't do it, what are they? What's the logic that they're relying on? What are people who are absolutely against feeding those to babies? How do they think about the story? So what is what are they trying to achieve? What's the barrier in their way? And what's the action that should be taken? Those are sort of different key elements of the story. Because ultimately what we're going to want to do is have easy story shortcuts to activate a frame in which not introducing green vegetables would be criminal, because it's just such the obvious thing that you should do in this situation. And I don't know what that story is, because you'd have to go through that process.
Right.
And not having worked on something similar, I sort of can't go off my experience of what I found in similar things. But that would be the key thing. How do people who think it's the most obvious, correct thing to do, and I'm not talking about experts only. You would talk to some experts, but you talk to parents who actually do it and are really, fanatical about it in a good way.
Now, the other, I'm sorry, did you want to say something else? The other issue that occurred to us as we looked at this was that a lot of the work that was in the Vic Health materials was, obviously done in Australia, which that is not the context that we work in the sense that we work in low and middle income countries. So I'm curious, do you think there's any specific changes that occur to you in the way you do this work in order to use it in low and middle income countries? For example, we couldn't obviously for some research elements like comment sections of news media, probably difficult to find in the lower middle income countries. And then social media in some low and middle income countries is obviously pretty strong, but in some it's not. And then there's the barrier for the rural areas and the urban. So what would you say to that about that issue when we would want to try to use this in a low and middle income country? What would we do?
Yeah, so I would say the thinking, the approach and framework behind it is the same, but obviously there's going to be methodological differences, and you may be able to start with a bit of public discourse analysis, but also understanding that perhaps your target audiences aren't the people who are on using those platforms or as much exposed to those platforms, because it's not just what people say, but what they're constantly hearing that matters, to have an understanding of the narrative context. But I would actually then switch to more focus groups and interviews, conversations with people, but structured ones in which you are specifically trying to understand the different parts of the story for them. What is it that you want for your baby? What do you think is the most important thing for your baby, from 1 to 2? And you don't start with food, you just start sort of broad. What do you want for your child? And then you could explore food. Why do you feed your baby? Leave it at that. As basic as the thing can be, to understand what are their motivators there, how are they thinking about what food is and what it does. And then gradually getting more specific to things. And leafy greens. Why do you eat leafy greens? It's what's available. It's what's cheap. It's expensive, so I rarely eat it. Whatever it is. So I would go into that sort of format, but with the exact same thinking in mind, that there are going to be some people that you're talking to who are dead set against it, and it's about understanding their story. There are going to be people who are already on board, understanding their story, and there's going to be people who sort of can go either way, and how they talking about it, and by sort of that sort of elicitation. But you can also then test. So doing an online survey might not be the appropriate methodology for the target audience.
Right.
What we're doing when we're doing that is we're testing whether, when we put it this way, do people agree or not? And when we put it that way, do people agree or not? But also, how does it shift the conversation? What happens when I talk about leafy greens being the building blocks of your child? If building blocks is a metaphor that works in that context, what happens to the conversation? What do they focus on after I've introduced that idea? And then I might introduce a different idea and say that people are always judging you, but I assume that people judge you based on what you feed your child. How does that influence you? And then you see what tends to happen to the conversation then. That's not a good frame. I'm just saying it's a very different way of talking about it. If you start with what are the cheapest, what's the most economical way of feeding your child, you'd have a different conversation. So testing things you think might work and then seeing how that changes the conversation. So I'll bring it back to the alcohol policy one just because I've got a good example of that. One way of sort of real life testing is you get a CEO, and I'm not thinking of Sandro here, although he has actually done this as well, in which an interviewer asks a question. The CEO then responds perfectly with a very sort of on-frame message, and the follow-up question from the interviewer is going to be different to what it would have otherwise been, because they've actually shaped the conversation in a different way. And so you could do that through focus groups. You could do that through one-on-one interviews where you intentionally put a different idea into the equation, see how that influences where people take it, to see if it works.
So you're interested in what their answer is, but you're interested in where they go next in their head. Is that right?
Because that's an indication that you've toggled them into a different frame.
Wow, it sounds very. So you're. It's not just it's not just maybe what they say, but where they're heading with it. Is that right?
Yeah. So the theory of framing is that people, when you're in a different frame, when you're thinking about something from a different perspective, you then reflect on different things, different actors, different situations, different ways of thinking about the problem, different things that you're wanting out of it, different values become relevant. Yeah.
Wow. So is it a question of, I mean, it sounds like you're able to sort of use some interesting understanding of the way people think about things to move them in a direction towards supporting a policy or maybe even, you know, doing things differently.
Yeah. And at the very least, I think you can make a difference. You can be more impactful by at the very least understanding what are the unhelpful things. When people don't want to give leafy greens to their kids, why? What do they say? What do they think? And then all the narratives that you hear them say becomes really useful information, because that's the stuff we don't want to tap into. We don't even want to negate it or myth bust that.
Right. So if they
reflecting on it from that perspective.
So if they said something like, "I don't give a leafy green vegetables because they're dangerous," which, you know, would reflect as
I've heard they've got toxins that are bad for babies.
right. So you
the
just
last thing to be doing is talking about how safe they are. They don't have toxins, because all you're doing is reminding them. Well, but my mother-in-law said they did have toxins, and who are you? And I don't know if I believe you. I just don't want to take any risks now that we're focusing on those toxins.
right. So in other words, you'd never go near that. You'd stick to some other to something that
This is the thing, right? You have to stick to something. You have to know what is your story. So, you know, if I'm not going to go talk about the toxin stuff, what is it when people do want leafy greens and feed it to the kids? Why do they do it? I go straight to that. So let's say, argument's sake, if someone says, I've heard that leafy greens are toxic, my response would be, there's a lot of outdated information about, I wouldn't repeat the myth, I'd say there's a lot of outdated information about it. What we know is that many families feed their children leafy greens because they see the way it makes them stronger. They're less likely to be sick, more likely to do all these things. And I activate a story of, wow, that sounds really good. That's exactly what I want for my child. And we move straight on. We pivot straight away from that toxic stuff.
What would you do, just as a matter of curiosity? What if you're in a situation where someone, let's say a particularly aggressive journalist, is like, well, you're not answering the question. What would you do in that?
So in that situation, you do your best to not repeat it. So you'd say, look, you know, whoever is repeating this myth, I would use it as a way of delegitimizing the messenger of the unhelpful story. So, I mean, and often we know why people are peddling myths or lies, and so we go to it. So again, alcohol policy, I'll go back to that because I know it so well, is if they're saying that red wine is healthy, right, it's good for your heart, that's a common myth. I'd say, well, the alcohol industry absolutely has an interest in peddling lies about their products when they know it increases your chance of cancer. They know that it actually increases your rate of stroke, but they never mention that, do they? So all I'm doing is sort of helping tell the story I already wanted to tell in the way that I respond to it. But I have to know the stronger you know what your story is, or the more focused you are on knowing what story you want to peddle, the more you can bring it back to that.
Okay. I guess another thing that occurs to me about the complementary feeding challenge that we face is that there might not be like an opposition in a sense. Am I incorrect in thinking that way? Is there always an opposition, or what? I mean,
no, sometimes there is an opposition. There are unhelpful ideas, and that they exist because there are people who strongly believe them and who keep repeating them. Like I've never come across an unhelpful idea that doesn't have a group of people who are strong adherents to that. They might not be institutionalized, but there's a worldview going on there. Yeah, so and it might not be appropriate to vilify those people because they might be the people that the person you're talking to trusts the most. Yeah, So no, there's not always a institutionalized opposition, but there's always an unhelpful worldview that is sitting behind the unhelpful stuff that's going on.
Okay. Then I guess I was also curious about we when we started talking about complementary feeding generally in our blog series, I think one of the things we sort of glided over without maybe really appreciating was it really is very complex. There's if at 6 months a child is very different even at 9 months in terms of what they might have teeth, and all the rest, so their diets will change. Do you think I'm curious if you were going to apply this approach, would you have to sort of think about? I mean, how would you handle that complexity? We're talking to practitioners and we're trying to give them information, and then they're going out and they're trying to do their programs. How would you deal with that complexity? Is there I mean, it just seems like it's... Go ahead.
By reducing it, because I have never come across an issue in which people have said, our issue is really simple, it's this. Every expert knows that their issue is incredibly complicated. And that is often why it's actually helpful to have an outsider come in and try and understand it, because they cannot understand it at the level of complexity as the experts, but they can get to a simple enough truth that transcends the complexity, and then that forms the backbone of your story. So, gender equality, right? That's a complicated thing. But in that one, and I think we need to sort of work on sort of applications of that story. But the story basically boils down to, in Australia, we all agree that it's wrong to treat people differently or to have different expectations for people, or for people to experience different pressures simply because of their gender. Everyone should be able to be themselves and not be held back by the fact that they're either male or female or neither. Yet, in too many cases, that's what happens. And then we can give examples of that people would believe are true, of the way in which men and women have been treated differently. Therefore, that's why we need this particular thing that we want, which is perhaps a policy that requires all workplaces to do audits of pay of men and women to figure out whether they're being paid differently. And that story, so we've applied that same story logic of principle of not treating people differently because of their gender, example of how that's happening, solution, which is about removing the barrier, which is about confronting a stereotype or showing or role modeling better ways of behaving and treating people. And that we applied that across parenting, gender-based violence. We applied it across sort of workplace policies, government policies. So I do think you can always bring it back to some basics things. And to be honest, feeding children, I feel like there's a simple story that we can tell there, and it might be, and again, totally uninformed here, but sort of if I were to think about what the simple story that you can then hook all the different elements onto and sort of make it a bit modular would be what we want for our children. So I don't know, did I in our responses did we talk about the Vision Barrier Action Framework?
Well, I have, I think...
Oh, it's in the guide, yeah. So vision, a little bit more complicated. It's vision, barrier, cause, action is the framework that I use. So what is the vision that people have for their kids? And they want them to grow healthy and strong and happy. And so that's what you activate. You start by engaging what they want for their children. What you want, what they want, shared purpose here. Then you frame the problem as the barrier. But often children aren't getting the nutrients they need to flourish and be strong, and as a result of that we see these problems here. Problems that people then go, oh yes, I've seen that, I don't want that for my child. You've explained that as a lack of nutrients. Tell me, how do I get enough nutrients? What we've found is that the combination of this and this is to provide, helps babies grow as strong as they could possibly be. So that would be some sort of simple framework. And then whether you're talking about adding in leafy greens, that goes into when the way you talk about the cause changes based on what the solution is, because the solution addresses the cause. So if you're saying that, babies are underweight And the cause of that is because many are not getting some essential iron or something, or whatever you get from the leafy greens that we want more of, because many are not eating leafy greens. Therefore, the solution is add leafy greens to the mix.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that you have to set up some sort of story that is that's aligned to their values and to sort of an existing sort of helpful way to look at the issue. Is that right? I mean,
yep, and that sidesteps any potential obvious negative, unhelpful framing.
Right. You would just, like, if they believed that there were toxins and all that, you just avoid that altogether. And then maybe if it came up, you'd say there's a lot of misinformation, that kind of thing about this. Okay, I think I have the basic idea here. But like I said, I think what we want to do moving forward is I'm going to take these notes and transcribe them and then try to pull out what we think are essential ideas. And there's somewhat of an internal discussion among ourselves already about how applicable this is to this issue of social behavior change for complementary feeding. So there's that issue. And then there's another conversation about, well, do we want to give people a primer, or do we want to give them an in-depth explanation of this approach? Do we want to give them the primer? Like, for example, the very practical thing you just outlined was something that stood out to some of us. You know, the vision, I can't remember, the vision barrier cause action, something like whatever, right? That was very appealing, and people thought, well, that would be really useful for people to know about and to, you know, sort of have an some basic understanding of. So there was an idea of, like, that's very practical and useful, and maybe we need to get that out. But I think given the way our conversation has gone, I think I'm tending more towards the explanation thing, because I think actually giving people practical guidance is not really helpful necessarily, because this is an expert's area. Yeah, and so I'm thinking that maybe we want to just explain it in depth, like what's happening when we talk about framing. What is framing and what's happening? So what I'd like to do is like I said, transcribe these notes and then come back to you, like maybe early in the new year, and try to develop something from it, like see what sticks out to me and about how it could be organized. Not necessarily a complete article, you understand, right? But just how it could be organized, and then maybe with some back and forth, we can flesh that out. Does that sound okay? I mean, does that sound feasible?
That sounds totally fine by me, and I think it also is a sensible approach. What we do, I rarely go to people and say, here's what you should be saying, here's what you shouldn't be saying, now go forth and conquer. I'll explain how the brain works, how we perceive things, because unless people understand why, they're not going to do the what.
Right.
So I think if you had to choose between telling them what to do or why to do it, I'd go with why, because that's the most important thing to get sorted first. I mean, I should say one sort of, in terms of the story that you're spinning, so that people can accept that they need to do things differently, is that what we're really doing is we're strengthening stories inside people's brains by repeating those stories as often as possible, so that those neurons fire together and then they wire together and then they become easier to activate next time. So it's all about having as coherent and consistent a story as possible, told by as many actors as possible, so that the person, at the end of the day, our audience, hears that story repeated over and over and over and over again through different words. You know, people are using different words to describe it. Maybe they're using different examples. But this is why a simple story is good, because then we can all be telling that same story every time, whether we're talking about leafy greens or we're talking about breast milk or we're talking about whatever. And then that becomes, over time, that becomes the dominant story, because we've strengthened it to the point where it becomes stronger. And so, you know, you've got, this is the dominant story at the moment. And what we're doing is we're not telling it, so it grows weaker over time, because it's sort of like a muscle that hasn't been activated, it grows weaker. And we're telling our story until it becomes the dominant story. We're not trying to wipe out this story. We're not trying to debunk it, because all we're doing is we're strengthening it, because we keep talking about it. And I think that's sort of a key metaphorical way of thinking about here. It's about strengthening our stories and allowing the other stories to wither away by not repeating them.
Okay.
and ideas that form those stories.
Okay. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time, Mark. I think there's still a lot that you're going to have to fill in gaps when you see this, and we're very grateful. I think I'm not sure how our series, we put contributors on it, and I think what I'd like to say is if we would have your name on it and Sandro's together, if that's acceptable to you guys, because it sounds like you really a lot of thinking behind this. We're Gates funded, and we do spread it out as far as we can. So I'm hopeful that you'd get some some feedback on it and some support for the continued efforts. Because it sounds very, very fascinating. But like I said, I'll be in touch in a few weeks with hopefully a week or so, with sort of an outline and as much of the gaps I can fill in as what I think it could go. And then hopefully we can, through a series of email exchanges, sort of sort it out from there.
Yeah, sounds fine.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark.
No worries.
It's been a pleasure.
Nice to meet you properly.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great. I really appreciate it.
Have a good Christmas, New Year's break.
Yeah, you too. You too. Are you have any special plans? You guys going to travel? No, probably not.
We had great plans. We've moved to Canberra 4 years ago from Sydney. We were going to have both of our sets of parents over so that our kids could have their grandparents here on Christmas morning. And both of our sets of grandparents live in the epicenter of the current outbreak in Australia.
Oh.
So that's happening.
Yeah. We had similar plans.
Come up with the Christmas Eve.
Yeah, we had similar plans. We were lucky to get our one of our sons back from California. So we're happy about that. But so
look, it is what it is. We'll just we'll scratch Christmas 2020. We'll focus on Christmas 2021. Try and make something of that, hopefully.
Right. Yeah. I mean, good riddance to 2020.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again, Mark. I'll be in touch.
No worries, Joe.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.